Long Walk to Water, Chapter 3, Southern Sudan, 2008. The smudge on the horizon gained color as Naya drew nearer, changing from hazy gray to olive green. The dirt under her feet turned to mud, then sludge, until at last she was ankle deep in water. There was always so much life around the pond. Other people, mostly women and girls, who had come to fill their own containers. Many kinds of birds, all flap and twitter and caw. Herds of cattle that had been brought to the good grazing by the young boys who looked after them. Naya took the hollow gourd that was tied to the handle of the plastic container. She untied it, scooped up the brown, muddy water, and drank. It took 2 gourdfuls before she felt a little cooler inside. Naya filled the container all the way to the top. Then she tied the gourd back in place and took the paddle cloth donut from her pocket. The donut went on her head first, followed by the heavy container of water she would hold in place with one hand. With the water balanced on her head and her foot still sore from the thorn, Naya knew that going home would take longer than coming had. She might reach home by noon if all went well. So just to take a quick break so you have a better understanding. Right, this is something like what we might see Naya doing, picking up some of that water. Not clean water, certainly. Students often say, well, they can boil it, which they do boil it many times if they have, the fuel to do so. And it does sort of kill some germs, but doesn't remove the dirt, and it doesn't kill all the germs and bacteria. So, although it is better, boiling the water doesn't fix all the problems. And there's this mention of the gourd. You might be familiar with the gourd, something like a pumpkin or squash. What they would do is they would dry those out, and you can see here, you might be able to dry it out, hollow it out, and have it be a container of sorts. It can also be sort of a scooper, like these gourds have been made into sort of scoops to get the water into the bucket or into the can. Okay. And then we last left off Salva when he was running away from his village. He looked back and it was on fire. It might be something like this. And now we'll continue reading Salva. Salva's part of his story. Southern Sudan, 1985. The tears were hot in Salva's eyes. Where had everyone gone? Why had they left without waking him? He knew the answer, because he was a child who might tire easily and slow them down and complain about being hungry and cause trouble somehow. I would not have been any trouble. I would not have complained. What will I do now? Salva took a few steps to see what he could see. On the far horizon, the sky was hazy from the smoke of the bombs. About 100 paces in front of him, he could see a small pond. Between the pond and the barn was a house, and yes, a woman sitting in the sun. Holding his breath, he crept closer until he could see the face clearly. The ritual scar pattern on the forehead were familiar. They were Dinka patterns, which meant that she was from the same tribe as Salva. Salva let out his breath in relief. He was glad to see she was not Newer. The Newer and the Dinka had a long history of trouble. No one, it seemed, was sure where Newer land ended and Dinka land began, so each tribe tried to lay claim to the areas richest in water. Over the years, where there have been many battles, large and small, between Dinka and Newer, many people on both sides had been killed. This was not the same as the war that was going on now between the rebels and the government. The Dinka and the Newer had been fighting each other for hundreds of years. The woman looked up and saw him. Salva flinched at her glance. Would she be friendly to a stranger? Would she be angry with him for spending the night in her barn? But at least he was not alone now, and that knowledge was stronger than the uncertainty about what the woman might do or say to him. He walked toward her. Good morning, Auntie, he said, his voice trembling. He nodded at him. She was old, much older than Salva's mother. He kept quiet, waiting for her to speak. You must be hungry, she said at last. She stood and went into the house. A few moments later, she came back out and gave him 2 handfuls of raw peanuts. And then he sat down again. Thank you, Auntie. Squatting on his haunches next to her, Salva shelled the nuts and ate them. He chewed every nut into a paste before he swallowed. trying to make each one last as long as he could. The woman sat without speaking until he was finished. Then she asked, "Where are your people?" Salva opened his mouth to speak, but his eyes filled with tears again. He could not answer. She frowned. "Are you an orphan?" He shook his head quickly. For a moment, he felt almost angry. He was not an orphan. He had a father and a mother. He had a family. "I was at school. I ran away from the fighting. I do not know where my family is." She nodded. "A bad thing, this war. What are you going to do? How will you find them?" Salva had no answer. He had hoped that the woman might have some answers for him. After all, she was an adult. Instead, she had only questions. Everything was upside down. Just to pause real quick to make it clear, Salva does not know this woman. He is calling her auntie. You might have heard that, in other communities, but in some, cultures, calling an adult aunt or uncle just a sign of respect. So he doesn't know this woman, but he's just calling her auntie because she's older and he's respecting her. Salva stayed in the woman's barn again that night. He began to make a plan. Maybe I can stay here until the fighting stops. Then I will go back to my village and find my family. He worked hard so she would not send him away. For 3 days, he fetched firewood from the bush and water from the pond, but the pond was drying up. Each day was harder to fill the gourds. During the daytime, Salva could hear the distant booming of artillery from the fighting a few miles away. With every shell that exploded, he would think of his family, hoping they were safe, wondering desperately when he would be with them again. On the 4th day, the old woman told him that she was leaving. "You have seen that pond is only a puddle now. Winter is coming and the dry season, and this fighting." She nodded her head in the direction of the noise. "I will go to a different village near water. You cannot stay with me any longer." Salva stared at her as panic rose inside him. "Why can't I go with her?" The woman spoke again before she could ask aloud. "The soldiers will leave me alone, an old woman on her own. It would be more dangerous for me to travel with you." She shook her head in sympathy. "I'm sorry. I cannot help you anymore," she said. "Wherever it is you walk, just be sure to walk away from the fighting." Salva stumbled back to the barn. "What will I do? Where will I go?" The words repeated themselves 1,000 times in his head. It was so strange. He had known the old woman for only a few days, but now he could not imagine what he would do once she was gone. He sat inside the barn and stared out, looking at the nothing. As the light grew dimmer, the noises of evening began. The buzz of insects, the rustling of dry leaves, and another sound. Voices? Salva turned his head toward the sound. Yes, it was voices. Some people were walking toward the house, a small group, fewer than a dozen. As they approached, Salva took sharp breath. In the fading light, he could see the faces of those nearest him. 2 of the men had patterns of V-shaped scars on their foreheads. Dinka patterns again, the kind that were given to the boys in Salva's village as part of the ritual of becoming a man. These people were Dinka too. Could his family be among them? And again, just to show you an image. Here we go. We read about the scarring on the foreheads and faces in those articles about the Dinka and the Newer. And a lot of students have, a strong reaction to seeing this, but, we do things similar to this. There are people who actually, brand themselves or scar themselves, but certainly tattooing is just as permanent and not much different. And, piercings as well. In fact, we borrow some of our style of piercings from Africans, particularly when we put the gauges in our earlobes and stretch our ears. You might see a lot of people doing that here. Again, not different from what these people might be doing in Africa. And this idea of tribes is also, interesting. Of course, Native Indians had tribes, which a lot of students bring up. But in America, the question, do we have something similar to tribes in America? And, we have a conversation in school with the students, and often we come to the idea that, yes, maybe if we are, we have a group of friends, if we identify with, a group of friends or a social group, that might be considered a tribe. Perhaps you're on the football team. Perhaps you're in a band. Perhaps you're really into music and you go to see live concerts all the time. That is sort of tribal. You could look at the bigger picture. You can look at, if you're following the news, some people might consider politics, being very tribal right now, where the Democrats, the Republicans, and they are often butting heads. So tribalism is not that foreign in this country. We just don't necessarily think of them as being tribes. And do we dress ourselves or style ourselves in a way to fit into a specific tribe? Again, we have these conversations in class, and often we come to the idea that we might have a haircut, we might wear certain clothes, we might pierce ourselves, we might get tattoos, you might wear certain jerseys of sports teams to fit in. And there's nothing wrong with fitting in, right? Just like these tribes in this story, and having identifying scars on their heads. It's a way to say, hey, I know you. I'm safe. We're safe together. In a similar way that somebody here would try to fit in with a certain group as well, because humans are social. We are social for a reason. We need connection, but we also need safety. It's a self-defense mechanism to try to fit in. And fitting in, there's nothing wrong with fitting in. It's important to fit in as long as we're not changing ourselves in order to do so. That's when we might be having a problem. All right, that's today. I will post another video for the next chapter.